Picture the Atlantic Ocean on a moonless night. Endless black water stretching to a horizon you can't see, the swell of cold waves lifting and dropping steel hulls like toys. There are no city lights and no friendly shorelines, only a thin hiss of spray and a sky crowded with indifferent stars. Somewhere below, hundreds of feet down, a low mechanical heartbeat hums through the dark. It isn't thunder or whales. It's a diesel engine, pulsing inside a narrow steel tube where men work by red lamplight. Up on the surface, merchant sailors can't see it, but they feel it in their bones. Somewhere out there, a predator is stalking them, measuring distance, counting seconds, waiting for a clean shot. This isn't mythology or superstition. It's a German U-boat, a quiet hunter built to turn the Atlantic into a graveyard and the ocean itself into camouflage. In the stillness between swells, even the air seems to lean forward and listen, as if the sea knows what's coming long before the men aboard do. During the early war years, those submarines were terror distilled into steel. Small enough to vanish beneath the swells, yet armed with torpedoes that could split a freighter in two, U-boats turned routine shipping routes into corridors of dread. Crews on Allied cargo ships learned to sleep in their boots, ready to bolt for the deck at the clang of the alarm. At night, they scanned the black water for a glint of periscope glass and listened for an engine beat that almost never reached the human ear. The fear was not of what they could see, but of what they couldn't. A steel shark waiting patiently below, nose pointed at their wake. Survivors spoke of explosions that arrived without warning and of decks that suddenly tilted toward the stars. Lifeboats drifted through oil and floating timber, while signal lamps blinked at empty waves. For weeks afterward, sailors woke to phantom alarms, hearts pounding at sounds that were only wind and rigging. For Berlin's naval planners, the strategy sounded brutally simple: starve Britain until its resolve cracked. The island lived on imports: grain, oil, munitions, spare parts, everything hauled across the Atlantic in slow convoys. If those lifelines snapped, factories would fall quiet, street lamps would dim, and shipyards would stall while families rationed the last tins in their cupboards. U-boat commanders absorbed the mission with clinical clarity. They were not knights seeking duels. They were hunters thinning a herd. The goal was not spectacle, but subtraction, tonnage removed from ledgers, ships replaced by silence. Every freighter sent down was more than a trophy. It was a calculation. So many calories denied, so many shells undelivered, so many miles of runway never laid. Win the numbers, they believed, and soon the island would lose the war without a final glorious battle to mark the moment. The first campaigns seemed to prove the theory. Whole convoys disappeared into the deep, their passing marked by swirls of crude, splintered crates and a drifting film of char on the waves. German papers dubbed it the happy time, as if fortune itself had enlisted with the U-boats. Crews returned to crowded quays and camera flashes, their conning towers garlanded with triumph. Young sailors imagined themselves as wolves of the deep, clever, invisible, and always upstream of their prey. Each patrol that ended with tallies chalked on a wardroom board fed a legend. Technology plus nerve had finally bent the Atlantic to German will. The story felt complete, almost neat. But legends have edges you can't see from inside them, and victories sometimes carry a fuse, already burning toward a charge no one has noticed yet. In the hush behind the cheering, flaws were forming, tiny, patient, mechanical and human, waiting for pressure to find them and crack them open in the most public way possible. Life inside those boats told a harsher truth. The air soured after days without surfacing. Humidity beaded and ran down bulkheads, turning every surface clammy to the touch. Bunks were warm not from comfort, but from bodies that rotated through them in relentless shifts. Diesel fumes soaked into hair and uniforms. Bread went stale to rubber, tempers frayed to threads. Men slept beside warheads and woke to the groan of pressure on the hull, that deep animal sound of the ocean, reminding them it meant to crush anything that lingered. Privacy was a memory. Silence, a myth. Yet the crews endured, driven by training, pride, and a belief that they were bending history. They learned to joke at fear, to ration hope, to count hours by battery charge and air quality. Courage here was not loud. It was the quiet choice to keep working, while the sea pushed its thumb against the metal. And still they sailed, convinced the ocean was on their side, that depth and darkness would keep their secrets safe. Above them, Allied sailors lived with a different kind of pressure, the kind that starts in the mind and settles in the gut. A voyage became a coin toss played in slow motion. Captains plotted jagged zigzag courses not to save time, but to steal certainty from the enemy's math. Radio silence wasn't etiquette. It was armor. When night fell and the sea turned to ink, every creak in the hull sounded like a warning. Men rationed cigarettes to guard their night vision and spoke in low voices as if the ocean itself could overhear. One moment you were bored and cold, the next you were running, counting lifeboats and headlamps. U-boats fought with torpedoes, but their sharpest weapon might have been doubt, the steady drip that hollowed out confidence long before the first explosion ever shook the deck. Even in calm weather, nerves frayed like old rope, and routine tasks, checking hatches, tending boilers, scanning horizons, felt like rituals meant to appease a sea that could not be appeased. Even in the high tide of U-boat dominance, hairline fractures had begun to spread. Coordinated wolfpack attacks relied on radio, and radio leaves fingerprints. Signals bounced and scattered, faint but chartable to anyone patient enough to listen. On lonely headlands and inside windowless rooms, Allied ears stretched wider every month. Technicians tuned aerials. Analysts traced patterns. A new kind of soldier, part engineer, part linguist, read the unseen war. The very system that made the U-boats lethal also made them legible. Each call for reinforcement, each routine weather report was a breadcrumb dropped on a chart. What had felt like magic to submarine captains was becoming arithmetic to their opponents. The ocean still hid steel, but numbers could sketch its outlines, narrowing guesses into probabilities and then into planned ambushes. The hunters were no longer alone in the dark. They shared it with people who could hear farther than they could see. Here quietly the battle tilted from sheer nerve to careful brains. The Atlantic turned into a chessboard far larger than any admiral could see at once. A convoy rerouted here, a decoy signal there, a radar calibration at pre-dawn. Each small adjustment tipped the balance. To many U-boat captains, Allied escapes felt like coin-flip luck. In truth, luck was being squeezed out of the equation by workshops and listening posts strung from Newfoundland to Gibraltar. Coordination tightened, escorts grew sharper teeth, and aircraft stitched new vision into the mid-ocean gap. The same darkness that once protected the hunters was slowly being taught to talk. Information began to move faster than ships. Messages that once took days could steer steel within hours. Each time a convoy slipped the net, someone on shore learned something permanent about where to place the next tripwire. The U-boats still drew blood, but the ocean's margin for error was shrinking, tide by tide. Down below, in the cramped glow of red lamps, crews still believed the ocean belonged to them. They read their returns as destiny and their escapes as proof of invisibility. They did not see the pattern tightening overhead, the web of listening posts and flying patrols being stitched together by people they would never meet. To the men in those pressure-hardened tubes, the Atlantic remained an ally, deep, wide, and loyal. But oceans are faithful to no one. The same water that muffled their approach would soon betray them, carrying sonar pulses and radar sweeps to the enemy. Confidence hardened into habit, and habits don't adapt even when the world changes. That is how hunters become prey, without realizing the moment the roles reversed. What felt like routine, check bearings, surface by night, call the pack, strike and slip away, was becoming a schedule the enemy could anticipate. The net was invisible, but it tightened with every escape. So we begin here, on a night without a moon, with confidence humming under the waves and dread riding the swells. This is a story about rise and recoil, about invention outrunning secrecy, and about courage on both sides of a periscope. What looked unstoppable will meet something just as relentless information shared faster than ships can sail, and strategies built from patterns no shell can break. From this opening, we move to the next chapter, how the menace grew, why early victories looked inevitable, and what those wins hid. In segment 2, we'll step into that surge of success, tracing the U-boat's ascent through tactics, technology, and timing, until the same signals that fed the hunt begin to mark the hunters on the map. Think of this as the breath before the plunge, the last calm moment when the ocean seems simple and one side seems to own the night. The truth is more complicated, and the turn is closer than anyone at sea can feel. That is where we're headed next. When war erupted in September 1939, the Atlantic stopped being just water between continents and became Britain's thin blue artery. Every gallon of fuel, every crate of grain, spare parts, copper wire, sulfur drugs, almost everything had to ride slow merchant hulls through cold, hostile seas. German planners saw a lever big enough to move the war without winning grand battles. Break the lifeline, and the island would dim and stumble, not with a single decisive defeat, but with 1,000 quiet shortages. Cold factories, empty wharves, ration books that grew meaner by the week. Submarines, cheap compared with capital ships, deadly in the right water, would be the pry bar. A U-boat didn't need to duel battleships. It needed to unship calories and fuel molecules to subtract tonnage until the math of survival failed. It was a strategy of pressure and patience, and at first, it looked terrifyingly efficient. The first patrols read like proof. Boats slid from their concrete pens and fanned into the North Atlantic, shadows under a black ceiling. They hunted alone at first, playing to the submarine's strengths, stealth, surprise, and the simple fact that most freighters were slow, lightly guarded, and tied to schedules they could not abandon. Alarms came late, if at all. A lookout's fleeting glimpse of a periscope, a white wake that meant a torpedo already on the way, a thud beneath the waterline that felt like a giant knocking from the deep, then the tilt, the rush, the cold. Survivors remembered the stink of oil and scorched paint, the terrible silence after the noise, and the way the sky looked wrong when a deck pitched toward the stars. In those months, the ocean felt enchanted in the worst way. Danger present, unseen, and almost always ahead of you. Convoys were loose, escorts thin, and every mile steamed felt like a bet laid against odds no captain fully understood. Success at sea quickly became a story on land. Newsreels stitched triumph from grainy frames, a conning tower breaking the surface, sailors grinning through salt and diesel, dockside crowds waving as lines were thrown ashore. Newspapers called it Die glückliche Zeit, the happy time, words that turned raw ledgers into legend. Recruiting offices swelled. Boys who had only known the sea from a pier imagined themselves as wolves of the deep. The image was clean and confident, sharp attacks, safe returns, totals chalked in neat columns. Within staff rooms, the mood hardened into belief. The Atlantic could be bent to will with enough hulls and nerve. It is easy to mistake a trend for a law when the graph only points one way, and in those months the line rose like a promise. Yet legends carry hidden costs and momentum can hide cracks. While cameras loved the surface, the real bill for these victories was being paid below decks, in metal, sweat, and nerves that never truly healed. Inside those boats, the legend met its price. A submarine was a steel tube jammed with machinery and men, a place where privacy ended at the shoulder. Air turned sweet-sour with battery fumes and sweat. Condensation dripped from frames. Bread staled into rubber. Coffee tasted like wet coin. Bunks were shared in shifts, still warm from another body. You slept beside torpedoes and woke to the hull's low groan, the ocean pressing a slow hand against the plates. Yet endurance became its own armor. Crews learned to joke at fear, to count hours by battery charge and air quality, to treat discomfort as proof they were winning. Courage here wasn't loud. It was repetition. Tasks done right when exhaustion made wrong feel easy, discipline that kept the sea from finishing what pressure had already begun. Each safe return confirmed the bargain. Accept the claustrophobia, the stink, the constant nearness of death, and the ocean would pay you back in victories chalked on a wardroom board. On the surface, Allied merchantmen learned a new rhythm, Hurry slowly, zigzag always, talk never. Convoys formed, but at first they were small and sloppy, their escorts thin on depth charges and thinner on training. Radio operators kept sets cold to avoid giving away a fix. Gunners stared into ink for wakes that would appear too late to matter. The Atlantic seemed emptier than before the war, and that emptiness felt crowded with threats. A captain's job shifted from making port on time to simply making it at all. He measured progress less by miles than by twilight survived, by the absence of explosions that could have happened, by the silence that might mean safety, or might just be the breath a hunter takes before it bites. Men learned to read tiny signs, the way a swell broke wrong, the odd echo off the hull, the anxious chorus of gulls that sometimes followed a convoy like superstitious priests. Routine became ritual, and ritual felt like armor, even when everyone knew it wasn't. German doctrine adapted faster than defenses. The lone hunter gave way to the wolfpack. One shadow spots a convoy, radios a bearing, then trails it like a pointer until others arrive. At night, the pack rises to the surface, diesels roaring, decks slick, crews clipped into lifelines, and attacks from several directions at once. Escorts pivot to meet one threat and expose another. Freighters surge and slow in panic, making clean targeting solutions. Signal flares paint harsh theater in the clouds, while tracers sew bright stitches across the dark. The method was simple in outline and savage in practice. Concentrate shock, confuse the defense, vanish before the sun can answer back. To crews who lived it, a wolfpack attack felt like being inside a room where every door slammed at once. Orders overlapped with prayers. The sea itself seemed to shout. And then, as quickly as it began, the horizon emptied again, leaving only drifting timber and the fizz of steam where hot metal met cold water. By 1940 and into 1941, the ledger told a harsher truth. Losses outpaced launches. British ration books grew stricter. Windows dimmed under blackout paint. Newspapers tutored readers on thrift and patience. In Whitehall, the math grew tight. If sinkings kept their pace, the island could bend before new American capacity smoothed the curves. Churchill thundered in public, but in private he fought numbers, fuel days, grain weeks, escort hours, because wars can end when logistics lose. Every convoy that sailed carried statistics as heavy as its cargo. How many ships, how many guns, how many chances left to buy another month of breath. Bimblies queued for basics, and shopkeepers learned to explain absence more gently than price. The fear was not of invasion tomorrow, but of emptiness next season. Factories idled for want of parts, boilers cold for want of coal, airfields quiet for want of fuel. Strategy had become a diary of shortages, and the ocean held the pen. U-boat crews marked progress in chalk and habit. Tonnage sunk became a scoreboard. Patrol badges a quiet currency of respect. Radio traffic thickened as packs ranged wider, position reports, weather bearings, calls for fuel. The chatter felt like proof that the ocean belonged to them, but signals leave fingerprints. Far away on wet headlands and in low rooms behind guarded doors, Allied ears stretched to meet the noise. Operators filed intercepts. Analysts drew lines. Mathematicians taught static to confess patterns. The very system that multiplied German power also made it legible, and legibility is the beginning of control. Each transmission left a smudge on a map. Each routine weather note whispered a position. What captains experienced as coordination, their enemies began to read as choreography, a dance visible from above, even when the dancers could not see each other at all. Even so, for a time, the numbers stayed brutal. Convoys vanished like chalk under rain. Insurance rates spiked. Shipping firms counted hulls the way medics count breaths. American yards could lay keels quickly, but steel engines and crews have their own clocks. In Ottawa and Washington, the fear was disturbingly simple. Europe might be lost mid-ocean, not by a decisive battle, but by attrition measured in empty warehouses and idle cranes. The psychological weight fell everywhere. On bridge wings and in living rooms, pressing down patience, bending wills. Sailors feared the unseen. Families feared the next ration cut. Ministers feared math. It is hard to rally a nation against subtraction, harder still to frame courage as waiting for ships that may not arrive. Yet waiting became policy, and policy bought time for ideas to ripen. In that pause between crisis and cure, small experiments began to matter more than speeches. And beneath the fear, change gathered. Escorts learned tighter drills. Scientists bled theory into hardware. Better sonar and radar, antennas that heard farther, aircraft that stitched vision across the mid-Atlantic gap. In hidden rooms, ciphers that had sounded like thunder became manageable weather. The first convoys that slipped a waiting pack felt like luck, then like pattern, then like policy. The boats did not feel this turn at once. From inside success, trend lines looked like noise. But the noise was resolving into shape, and shape invites a new plan. That plan, tools and tactics, wolves and counters to wolves, is where our story heads next, as we open the machinery of the undersea war and see how design, training and radio discipline made the hunters lethal and, eventually, vulnerable. Beneath the cold Atlantic swells, the German U-boat was far more than a steel tube with torpedoes. It was a tool designed to change the arithmetic of war. On the surface, it ran on loud, efficient diesels, gulping air and charging batteries. Below, electric motors turned the boat into a moving shadow, trading speed for near silence. The pressure hull flexed like a ribcage under strain, and the control room ticked like a watch, valves, gauges, stopcocks, trim wheels, all speaking a language of needles and hiss. Periscope optics cut through haze. Hydrophones let crews see with sound, discerning propeller notes like fingerprints. Nothing on board existed for comfort. Bunks overlapped torpedoes. Paint blistered from condensation, and every shift was a dance of inches. Battery management ballast, angle on the bow. The captain's math lived second by second. A U-boat could wait unseen for days, rise to periscope depth, bite hard, and slide away before its victim even knew the sea had eyes. The sting lay in the torpedoes. Most boats carried 4 bow tubes and 1 aft, loaded with G7 torpedoes, using contact or magnetic pistols designed to explode beneath a keel, where shock would break a ship's back. Early in the war, those weapons misbehaved, prematures, duds, runs too deep, but torpedomen learned to tune them like temperamental instruments. They tested depth settings with rulers and plumb lines, checked pistols twice, and corrected gyro angles by fractions of a degree. Spreads, 3 or 4 at staggered bearings, turned probability into destruction. A perfect underkeel detonation produced a fountain of water, a hollow thump, and then a groan as frames failed. Lights blew out, steam burst from ruptured pipes, and cargo shifted with a deadly slide. On a dark night, the only warning might be the ghostly white wake of a running fish, and seconds later, the sea itself lifting the target apart. Machinery alone didn't make the boats terrifying. Doctrine did. Admiral Karl Dönitz saw that a solitary submarine was a nuisance, while a coordinated swarm could strangle an island nation. His wolfpack concept, Rudel, turned open ocean into a grid of timed intersections. A single contact keeper shadowed a convoy and radioed bearings to BDU, the U-boat command. Then he trailed like a pointer dog while reinforcements sprinted to join. Encrypted orders sent other boats converging from far horizons, disciplined by fuel states, weather, and sea room. After dark, they rose together for speed and visibility, attacking from multiple axes to stretch escorts thin and to overload lookouts. The method prized patience. Keep contact, report regularly, choose the moment, and crush the formation in a short, savage window before dawn, wrote everyone's position in light. Night surface tactics exploited physics. Submerged, a U-boat crawled. On the surface, it could outpace a loaded convoy by several knots and choose its angle. Early Allied radar, Type 286 and contemporaries, was crude, often blinded by rain clutter and sea return, so a low silhouette could ghost through a picket line. Lookouts, clipped to lifelines as cold spray hammered their faces, learned to read the faint smear of a funnel on the horizon or the way starlight broke across a wake. Captains used wind and moon to mask approach, throttling diesels to let merchant engine noise hide their own. At the chosen instant, they drove straight into the columns, fired at close range, then veered off to set up again. To men on the bridge of a freighter, the attack felt like doors slamming in a dark house, everywhere at once and impossible to locate. Inside, an attack felt like choreography under pressure. Compartments barely wider than shoulders became nerve centers where seconds mattered. The navigator murmured bearings from a sweat-spotted chart. The sound operator counted propeller blades through damp headphones. The plainsman trimmed depth by feel as ballast hissed, and the boat took a shallow angle. Orders cracked down the passage. "Torpedo loss!" Then the hiss of compressed air, the thud as a door shut, and the long slide into silent running. Men greased cutlery, secured loose tools, and killed non-essential pumps to quiet the hull. Sonar pings came as metallic heartbeats. Depth charges marched closer with a rising whine, and paint dust fell like grey snow. In that hush, courage wasn't a shout, but a steady hand that kept the boat true, while the sea tried to fold it like paper. Radio was the magic and the weakness. Enigma encoded signals stitched scattered hulls into a single organism, carrying weather, convoy courses, and rendezvous plans. Operators believed the cipher unbreakable, so they used it freely, sending clean bearings and routine reports that felt invisible. The bandwidth was small and the windows brief, but physics is patient. Every burst left a fingerprint in the ether. High-frequency direction finding, HF, DF, Huff Duff, could sniff a bearing from hundreds of miles away. With 2 or 3 stations, triangulation put a pin on the chart. Escorts soon mounted compact HF-DF sets of their own, catching a boat the moment it broke silence to call the pack. What felt like ghost talk to the sender became coordinates to a patient listener, and coordinates are where ambushes begin. German engineering kept pace with the duel. Periscopes gained clearer optics and stabilized heads. Snorkels arrived, so diesels could sip air while a boat stayed shallow, trading visibility for carbon monoxide headaches and a skinny mast that radar might still catch. Batteries inched forward in capacity. Trim pumps grew quieter. Torpedoes learned new tricks. The T5 acoustic model, for example, homed toward a destroyer's propeller note, forcing escorts to think about their own noise for once. The Allies countered with Foxer noisemakers and tactical changes, but for a season, each German innovation felt like a new mask the hunter could wear. Boats also refined crash dive drills to razor speed, measuring the time from alarm to periscope kiss by heartbeats. Snorkel operation brought its own perils. A sudden wave could slam the head valve shut, and the still-running diesels would try to pull air from the hull, dropping pressure so fast ears screamed and lungs begged. Crews called it the vacuum. The mast's tiny radar return was not invisible either, and Allied sets grew sharper. Every small increment of stealth seemed to cost stamina, and stamina is a finite store on a boat already short of sleep. Hardware mattered, but psychology shaped the battlefield. Merchant crews lived by blackout ritual and zigzag discipline, and they learned to dread quiet nights when nothing moved but imagination. U-boat captains weaponized waiting, shadowing a convoy for days to let fatigue hollow judgment. A spark on a rail, a sloppy radio check, a helmsman who straightened a zig too early. Tiny errors multiplied at sea and turned into clean solutions for a periscope sight. Men on watch strained for the faintest wake or periscope glint, while officers timed course changes like chess moves. By the time the first torpedo struck, many victims were already tired enough to make the second easier. Watches rotated until faces blurred, coffee turned bitter, and rumor did the rounds. Phantom subs, cursed routes, lucky ships. Lookouts learned to distrust hope and to trust angles. False contacts wasted fuel and nerve. Real ones punished the smallest lapse. The sea is patient, and so were the hunters tracking from below, letting human fatigue do arithmetic that torpedoes would only finalize. Adaptation hardened the escorts. Corvettes and destroyers learned to share contacts, ladder depth charge patterns, and box a suspected contact, until exhaustion did what explosives could not. hedgehog mortars, threw banks of contact bombs ahead of the bow, turning guesses into geometry. Support groups detached from convoys to hunt for hours after an attack, turning defense into counteroffense. Aircraft with radar and lee lights prowled the mid-ocean gap, forcing boats down by day and catching them flat-footed at night. Escort carriers put air patrols where none had existed. Each Allied improvement stretched Donitz's resources thinner and demanded more signaling, which in turn painted a clearer picture for analysts ashore. Hunter-killer groups formed around escort carriers ranged far from the convoys, using radar, HF-DF, and refined tactics like the British creeping attack, where one ship held contact while another executed a slow, precise approach. Sonobuoys and improved ASDICs widened the search net. The cooperation of sea and air began to feel mechanical, repeatable, dangerous to an enemy that once thrived on surprise. By mid-war, the U-boat remained lethal, yet the seeds of reversal had taken root. The very tactics that brought early triumph, night surface runs, heavy signaling, unshakable faith in Enigma, were writing clues onto Allied charts. In rooms far from the weather, mathematicians and engineers married intercepts to traffic analysis, using cribs like routine weather lines and operator habits to pry at keys. Noise became placement, placement became ambush. Information began to travel faster than steel, and convoys slipped nets while traps formed for the hunters. The next turn in this story belongs to the codebreakers at Bletchley Park and the quiet miracle of turning chaos into sentences, a moment when the Atlantic itself started to speak in a language the Allies could finally understand. At Bletchley Park, Hut 6 and Hut 8 refined bomb runs that chewed through rotor settings, and Ultra began to whisper where packs would form before the boats themselves quite knew it. Weather reports, call sign habits, even operator quirks became footholds. In that fusion of math and radiocraft, the tides started to favor the convoys. What follows is that hidden campaign, numbers against rotors, patience against procedure, where silence itself became a language the Allies learned. Far from the spray of the Atlantic, a quieter war unfolded in brick huts and borrowed manor rooms, a struggle against a box of rotors and wires that Germany trusted like armor. The U-boat's lifeline was Enigma, a cipher whose alphabet rewired itself with every key press and whose daily settings rolled over at midnight with clockwork cruelty. Signals officers believed the math was on their side. Astronomical combinations, strict procedures, disciplined operators. Breaking it sounded like fantasy, yet Britain gathered an unlikely cast. Mathematicians, linguists, engineers, chess fiends, radio hounds, then gave them one blunt assignment: read the enemy's mail while the ink was still wet. It wasn't glamorous. It was pencils, paper, headphones, and the stubborn refusal to accept impossible. As wolfpacks hunted convoys by night, these civilians hunted patterns by lamplight, betting that logic could outrun torpedoes if only they could make the numbers talk before the next key change erased the trail and the ocean claimed another ship. Bletchley Park, a Victorian house with hedges and bicycles, did not look like a headquarters for a secret offensive. But behind blacked-out windows, an improvised factory for intelligence ran in shifts 7 days a week. Recruits arrived from Cambridge and Oxford lecture halls, from telegraph offices, from crossword competitions and code clubs. Work split into huts, each with a narrow purpose. Intercepts sorted here, call signs indexed there, machine rooms hammering away in the next, translators and naval analysts clustering over maps in another. The place felt like organized chaos, tea mugs rattling on typewriters, couriers sprinting with dispatches, chalkboards dense with acronyms only insiders could love. No one person saw the whole picture. Compartmentalization kept secrets safe and egos small. The rule was speed. If you couldn't turn a plausible guess into a testable lead before midnight, you had nothing. The enemy's clock was not just a schedule. It was a weapon designed to make certainty arrive too late. Enigma itself looked harmless. A wooden case, a keyboard, a nest of rotors the size of teacups, but its design multiplied uncertainty. Pressing one letter sent current through a plug board that swapped paired characters, then through a cascade of rotors whose internal wiring differed and whose positions stepped with every keystroke. Thanks to a reflector, the signal returned by another path, lighting an output lamp that was never the same for the same input twice. Add rotor order, ring settings, starting positions and plugboard pairs, then change them daily, and you get an ocean of possibilities deep enough to drown any manual attack. German doctrine relied on that immensity. By the time the Allies solved a message, it would be irrelevant. But immensity isn't invincibility. It's a field where machines can run faster than fingers, where pattern and probability can carve lanes through the chaos, if you can afford the machines and organize the work. The first true breach began not in England but in Poland. Years before tanks crossed the frontier in 1939, mathematicians Marian Rejewski, Jerzy Różycki, and Henryk Zygalski modeled Enigma's wiring from permutations and built tools, the Bomber and Zygalski perforated sheets, that turned nightmarish searches into method. They also mapped operator habits and procedural shortcuts, proving that human convenience is a cipher's favorite accomplice. In July 1939, with war coming on like weather, Polish intelligence shared everything with British and French counterparts: methods, wiring, even replica machines. That handover didn't win the race, but it moved the starting line. Bletchley Park began its sprint with head start and hard evidence, not just hope. The gift mattered doubly at sea, where each month saved meant convoys not sunk, factories still warm, and a coastline that might stay supplied long enough for American industry to wake and for new tactics to grow teeth. On that foundation, Alan Turing and Gordon Welchman designed the British bomb, a room-sized electromechanical hound that chased keys by eliminating impossibilities. The trick was the crib, a smart guess about text likely appearing in a message, a weather header, a routine preamble, a naval formality. Wire the guess into the bomb, and banks of drum rotors spun through settings, rejecting millions per minute until a few candidates remained. Welchman's diagonal board accelerated the cull by exploiting logical constraints across the plugboard. When a machine halted on a promising stop, runners grabbed the slips and dashed them to checking rooms, where clerks tried the key against fresh intercepts. All of it raced midnight, when the key space flipped and yesterday's victory became scrap. The sound of the hut was industrial. Relays chattering like rain on tin, motors whining, penciled letters blooming into possible sentences, each one a chance to steer steel before the ocean could. Machinery alone could not keep pace without a pipeline of disciplined guesswork. Across Britain and the Empire, WWII stations listened to the ether, RAF huts on lonely headlands, naval posts lashed by spray, merchantmen with extra wires rigged for appetite. Operators copied Morse bursts by ear, mistuned sets, and storm-warped signals, shipping rolls of tape and carbon copies by motorbike and teleprinter. At Bletchley, traffic analysts tracked call sign habits, message timings, frequencies, and net structures. German radio men, fatigued or proud or simply human, repeated phrases, reused signs, or sent corrections that echoed the original, tiny cracks a statistician could pry with a screwdriver made of algebra. Thousands of mostly young women kept the system moving, sorting, typing, wiring, checking, translating. They didn't need the whole picture to feel the stakes. If a slip missed a run, a convoy might sail into a night with too many wakes and not enough dawn. Reading was only half the problem. Using what you read without revealing how you read it was the art. Ultra, the label stamped on the choicest decrypts, traveled in small circles. Admirals learned to explain miracles. A patrol aircraft happened to notice an oil slick. A fishing trawler reported suspicious flares. A submarine watch sighted a periscope at dusk. Orders moved by courier, not radio, and successes were spaced and shaded to look like luck. When a U-boat found empty ocean where a convoy should have been, the captain blamed weather, bad intelligence, or simple chance, not a broken cipher. That ignorance kept the door open. The price of one too-perfect interception might have been a global change in German procedures. The reward for restraint was another week of messages that arrived in time to matter. The operational effect unfolded first as a pattern and then as a curve. Convoys began to bend around danger with uncanny timing. Escort groups arrived in strange patches of sea, as if someone had sketched footprints only they could see. Hunter-killer groups roamed with purpose, pairing HF-DF bearings from ships and shore with decoded contact reports to position traps where night once favored the submarine. Successes were still incremental. One pack avoided, one boat forced down, but totals matter in logistics wars. Sinkings eased, arrivals rose, and insurance men recalculated. The Atlantic, once a haunted corridor, felt marginally less cursed. For sailors, the change was gut-level, not analytic. Fewer emergency signals, more ships making landfall with holds still heavy. They did not know the name Ultra, but they trusted the new rhythm, a sense that the ocean had started to whisper warnings early enough for engines to answer. Germany answered with complications. Naval Enigma added a fourth rotor for Atlantic traffic. Plugboard habits tightened. Keybooks rotated faster. Reading went dark at times, then flickered back as more bombays came online in Britain and the United States, and as traffic analysis filled gaps when pure decryption failed. The duel became seasonal, winter static, summer storms, procedure changes, operator quirks, each tilt of the board opening and closing windows. But the Allies were scaling. More intercepts, more machines, better cribs, faster verification, and crucially, fusion, HF, DF bearings, radar sightings, and decrypted fragments layered into plots that predicted where a wolfpack would be, not just where it had been. Intelligence turned from a diary into a timetable. The U-boat arm still struck hard, yet the cost of each patrol climbed as ambushes multiplied and safe routes evaporated into lines an analyst had already erased with a pencil hours earlier. Breaking Enigma didn't sink boats by itself. It bent space and time so that other tools could bite. Radar that saw through weather, lee lights that pinned silhouettes to waves, long-range aircraft that stitched the mid-ocean gap, escorts drilled to turn a ping into a kill. Ultra told commanders when to be sharp and where to wait. HF-DF told them which bearing to trust. Practice turned that guidance into steel and depth charges delivered at the right second. From here, our story leaves the huts and returns to the grey swells, the convoys that learned to move like armored caravans, the hunter-killer groups that learned to prowl, and the skies that finally made the ocean small for submarines that needed air. In Segment 5, Allied counterattack convoys and air patrols, we'll see how information became geometry, boxes, patterns and patrol arcs, and how, by the spring of 1943, the hunters discovered the sea had learned their names.